Hey, this is Scott Allen Miller here on the Sam IT channel on YouTube. Today I want to talk about hot spares in your RAID arrays. It's an easy thing to think that a hot spare is going to be just the safest, the best, most logical thing you can do, and a lot of people just jump into using them. And they are generally a pretty good thing from a reliability perspective. But there's a lot of factors that go into hot spares, and I want to talk about them to have a better understanding of when they make sense, if they make sense, and when they may actually pose a danger. Now first, let's describe what a hot spare is. When you have a RAID array and you need to replace a failed drive, a hot spare is a disk that is already attached to, powered on, and spinning in your server or chassis for your storage. And when you have a failure, it is automatically added to the failed array as if you'd had a technician go in, pull out the bad drive, pop in a good drive, but it's all done automatically by the hardware. They're very popular for things like remote locations, maybe a server that is stuck at a forestry station out in the woods many miles from anywhere that the tech could get to them, maybe something in Antarctica where you'd have to put a spare part and a tech on a ship to get there, if you're on a Navy vessel, things like that. Hot spares, super obviously logical because you don't need a tech to replace a failed drive. You could, in theory, have a warm spare, which is the same kind of thing, but the disk is sitting in the machine and needs manual intervention. This is a real thing. It is more popular with software RAID than hardware RAID, and it's not very popular, period. It still requires humans to be involved, but it's there and it doesn't require a human to go to the site to do a physical replacement. So it does have benefits, but it's pretty uncommon and nobody talks about warm spares. People who use them don't even talk about them, and typically they don't even know what they're called. They think they're hot spares and just lump them together. A cold spare, which should be logical, is having the same spare but not having it in the chassis. This is actually pretty common because a lot of people fill their chassis and have no room for a hot or a warm spare, so having a cold spare that just sits nearby is good. This works if you have a technician nearby but maybe not a hard drive delivery service. For example, if you're in Manhattan, you might be able to get a replacement drive 15 minutes from a warehouse. Real numbers. If you're in the middle of South Dakota, it might take you 3 days to get that replacement disk, but if you had a cold spare and a technician who was on site, they could just grab it, pull out the bad drive, pop in the good one, and you're off and running. So cold, warm, and hot spares all have different use cases. They all make sense. They're all very logical and straightforward, and in a lot of cases we choose some mix of them for whatever our scenario is. So let's look at when hot spares actually make sense in different types of arrays. First of all, RAID 0 has no redundancy, therefore spares make no sense. They logically don't exist. What does a spare even mean in a RAID 0 array? Nothing, so we just rule that out. Let's look at mirrored arrays. RAID 1, also, you never have hot spares. Never. But for different reasons. With RAID 1, any additional drive that you have access to can be added to the array itself. So if we think of cold spare as being the least protective because you have to have a person interact and go get it, a warm spare as being better because it's in the system and warmed up, which makes the drive a little bit more reliable, and you don't need a technician to physically touch the box, only someone, a system admin, to control the disk and add it to the array. Hot spare is even better yet because it requires no human interaction whatsoever. The machine automates the replacement. But having a disk in the array already is even another step better, and a pretty dramatic one, because there's zero recovery time. With all spares of any type, there's always a certain amount of time in which it takes for that hot spare to join the array and become useful. That may be as short as 10 minutes, it could be as long as several weeks, and in some cases I've actually seen several months. That's a period of risk where that hot spare is not yet part of the array and your array remains at risk. Sure, you got because it's a hot spare, you got it into the array and started that process as soon as possible, but you may be shaving off 15 minutes of disk replacement on one end, which is just part of a 2 or 3 week recovery period overall. That 15 minutes may not matter at all, which we'll get to in a little bit. But on RAID 1, you would never do this, because if you could have a hot or a warm spare, you would simply add that to the array because there are no downsides. You already are paying for the power of a hot or warm spare to be there and powered on, just not part of the array. With RAID 1, you could have that as part of the array live mirrored, and not only have zero recovery time with zero penalty, you would also get a purely bonus increase in your read performance by having that disk as part of the array. For example, a typical RAID 1 is a two-way mirror. Instead of a hot spare with a two-way mirror, you could simply make that a three-way mirror. Same price, same power, same chassis, same everything. but you would get a 50% increase in your read performance. Your write performance would stay flat. It's always the same in a RAID 1. But your safety from a recovery standpoint would be significantly improved, even though RAID 1s typically don't need a hot spare because they're so safe anyway. And your performance would be improved by a pretty measurable amount. So with RAID 1 and RAID 0, hot spares are absolutely out of the question. There's no scenario where they should arise. That means that we should be looking at them in mirrored arrays only with RAID 10. Now with RAID 10, we can break down the numbers, but we run into similar scenarios with small RAID 10s. Let's start on the small side. If we have the smallest RAID 10, which is 4 disks, a hot spare means a 5th disk. Now, that can make sense in extreme situations, but make sure you watch my video on large-scale RAID study anecdote, because it's important to understand just how reliable a RAID 1 or a RAID 10 is, to then run the numbers and see if the cost of a hot spare really does much. Because remember, with a hot spare, you're not gaining anything except for the faster replacement. And considering the reliability of a small RAID 10, this may not make sense because you're already so reliable that that extra money is just thrown away. What can happen if you have a very small 4-disc or maybe a 6-disc RAID 10 and you want that extra reliability of having a hot spare, there's a decent chance that once you've gone that extra step, that the small amount of additional money to get a second hot spare, and instead of using them as hot spares, but using them as triple mirroring for the underlying RAID 1 arrays under the RAID 0 of the RAID 10, will more likely be worth it, because the leap in protection. So let's run some real numbers. What if each of your disks is $250? Then your RAID 10 array is $1,000. Your RAID 10 array with a single hot spare is $1,250. But the protection granted, the benefits granted by that $250 are minimal. Almost no data protection because the original set is so safe, and no performance, no capacity gains, nothing on the other end. But if you were to spend an additional $250, so instead of $1,250, taking it up to $1,500, yes, it's a bit of money, but it's a small amount of money compared to the last $250 that was just spent. You would then get not only a enormous leap in data protection. Yes, it's already insanely safe, but the percentage of safety of the remaining risk, you would reduce almost all of it to an absurd amount. It's really hard to describe just how much safer this would suddenly become by having 2 triple mirrored RAID 1 arrays under the RAID 0. And you would get, once again, the 50% performance boost that we would have with the RAID 1s as well. So that last $250 would provide you something like 95% of the benefits of the entire $500 spend on hot spares at all. So in a small RAID 10 case, you almost always don't have hot spares at all, and when you do, you almost always go to triple mirroring instead. The tiny sliver of value where you would do a single hot spare for a RAID 10 that is small is so unbelievably small, you can almost assume it should not exist. Basically, if you feel you need a hot spare, you need triple mirroring. But probably you didn't need it at all. Now in a large RAID 10, this changes. If you had, say, 20 or 22 or even 24 disks in a RAID 10, and these are decent numbers because you can get standard chassis that will hold this number, and often 25 small form factor disks, which means you can have a 24 disk RAID 10 with a single disk hot spare, all within a single chassis and not giving up any empty bays. This is where hot spares with a RAID 10 become very sensible. When the array becomes very large, one, your risk of some of the disks failing becomes much higher. Obviously, with 24 spinning disks instead of 4, you have something like a 6 times chance of something failing at some point, therefore needing the hot spare. And the hot spare, instead of being a 1-to-4 ratio against your disks, is a 1-to-24. So you have a 600% gain in efficiency as to how much you have to spend for that hot spare versus the size of the original array. So the relative cost of that hot spare becomes trivial as opposed to being incredibly significant in the really small arrays like RAID 1 or a 4-drive RAID 10. So really large RAID 10s, hot spares, very sensible and very important for increasing the overall safety. Small RAID 10s, almost never would you have a hot spare. And in between, you just have to gauge which side you lean to. Is it safe enough? Does it make more sense to go to triple mirroring? Is it big enough to warrant having a hot spare? At some point, you have to make judgment calls. But certainly, if you have a 25 bay with 24 discs, chances are you want the hot spare. And chances are, if you have 4, assume you don't. Now, for Parity RAID, we have a much more complex scenario because we have 2 big factors. One is that Parity RAID is triggered into array failure by the rebuild, by the resilver process, and its rebuild period can be extremely lengthy. With mirrored RAID, rebuild times are relatively low, the time to copy one disk to another. In Parity RAID is where we often see rebuilds of even a normal hard drive stretching into many days, often weeks, and sometimes months, especially if the array is under any kind of use during that time. This has a lot of influence on your hot spare decision. With RAID 5, pretty much you never want a hot spare. Now, often we don't want RAID 5 at all. That's a different discussion. We'll assume you have RAID 5 for whatever reason. Because RAID 5 is so incredibly risky, having a hot spare that automatically triggers a rebuild on detection of failure is not something you normally want, because when running RAID 5, you almost always want to stop the array, take a backup, and have a working backup before you try replacing a disk. You do not want to automatically replace disks in a RAID 5 because it is so dangerous when you've replaced the disk. That may be the thing that triggers the total data loss, so you want to avoid that until you're confident you're at a moment you can do it. So basically you don't want it automated. So warm spares in RAID 5, very sensible. Hot spares, not so sensible. Also keep in mind that we have that time relationship thing, right? If it takes you 3 days to replace that disk from a resilver process, how much time are you saving by having the hot spare? Is it 15 minutes? Is it 2 hours? Those numbers may be completely inconsequential compared to the overall size of the rebuild. If you feel that a hot spare is important for your RAID 5, it probably tells you you shouldn't have a RAID 5. That's really what you should read from that you have other problems. It doesn't solve the problem that you're perceiving. There's another thing with Parity RAID that mimics what we found with RAID 1. Remember, with RAID 1, we never, ever use a hot spare because it's always better to add it to the array. This is copied in the Parity world, but it's not quite a never, it's a normally. When you have a RAID 5 and you're tempted to have a hot spare, what that tells you is you should actually have a RAID 6 by simply taking the same hard drives you had with your RAID 5 plus hot spare and reconfiguring them as a RAID 6, you get a huge leap in safety. I mean huge, orders of magnitude safer with the same disks, and you get a very small performance boost on your read side. There may be a penalty on the write side depending on your workload, but you get a guaranteed boost on your read side and an unbelievable leap in data protection. So we would, in any case that you can, you would move to RAID 6. Same thing happens with RAID 6. If you wanted to have RAID 6 with a hot spare, you should consider moving to RAID 7 or RAID 5.3, depending on your naming conventions. And the problem here is that not every controller offers RAID 7, and in fact it's incredibly rare. We're expecting to see it more and more in the future, but it's been around for about 14 years at this point, and we still only see one major implementation of it, which is the ZFS from Oracle, or OpenZFS on most platforms like FreeBSD, FreeNAS, Ubuntu, and so forth, has the triple parity of RAID 7, and you would, if you felt you needed RAID 6 with a hot spare, you should be considering whether a RAID 7 array would be better for you. Same reasons. Boost in read speed, possible hit in write performance depending on the workload, with an unbelievable order of magnitude leap in data protection over having the hot spare. Also, it doesn't have that rebuild time penalty, right? It's simply, if a RAID 7 loses a disk, it just goes down to a RAID 6 for all intents and purposes immediately. So you still have the protection of the RAID 6 that moment, and you can decide when to kick off the replacement process when it makes sense. So those factors are pretty big. Now, given that RAID 7 isn't always available, RAID 6 with a hot spare is a relatively common scenario, because RAID 6 is much riskier than RAID 10 in nearly all scenarios, and slightly riskier in basically all. Having the hot spare, because it already has dual parity protection, you're not directly exposed to an immediate failure should you kick off that resilver process like you do with RAID 5. It is often a compromise to use RAID 6 with hot spare. So this is the spot where you'll see it most often. If you are then looking at RAID 7 and considering a hot spare there is no RAID 8 on the market today, and we don't expect one for the foreseeable future. The algorithms get pretty complicated and no one's tackling that. There aren't enough people using RAID 7 yet for anyone to consider RAID 8 to be a realistic thing to approach at this point. With RAID 7 then, it would be very reasonable in a large array to consider RAID 7 with a hot spare. Of course, anytime you're adding a hot spare to a RAID 6 or a RAID 7 and you can't go to a RAID 7 or a RAID 8 instead, you should look and see if RAID 10 makes sense for you. Often that will be the case. Now, in large arrays, that may not be the case because when you get really large, the cost or the penalties of moving to RAID 10 in your environment may be too large. And so the RAID 6 or the RAID 7 with a hot spare may easily make sense. It's just important to know that that's a trigger point for when you should just take a moment and say, would RAID 10 make sense? It doesn't mean it does, it just means it's a good time to double check. Now, there's another thing we need to consider is that hot spares can be global. And what this means is that you may not have, everything we've talked about is a hot spare with an array. But what if you had an array controller that had many arrays and you could have one hot spare that is shared between them? Meaning, any given disk that fails anywhere amongst many arrays, the hot spare will be assigned to whatever one it is. This allows your hot spare cost and penalties to be minimized because it's shared between a large workload. This can be very sensible. So if you have a big controller or a large software system, such as an extremely large mini computer where you may have scores or even hundreds of disks attached to it, having one or two global spares that can be used anywhere that they're needed across all those separate arrays, that makes sense and is almost always a good way to go because it's just almost no cost. In small arrays, the cost of a hot spare is just really large. There's almost always a better answer. But in giant arrays and in multiple giant arrays, sharing one, totally different. So we tend to see this, of course, in mini computers, but also with large NAS and SAN devices, simply because they're big storage dedicated devices. That's where lots of arrays happen. The other types of RAID arrays, such as RAID 60 or RAID 70, which can sometimes become enormously large, they will kind of combine the RAID 6 and RAID 7 decisions with the global hot spare decision. Obviously, it's still a single array, so it's not exactly a global hot spare, but it behaves like that. Lots of underlying arrays, and the whole thing gets bigger and bigger, and it makes sense to have a hot spare in those cases, especially because a really large RAID 60, while safer than a really large RAID 6, is still it's much closer to RAID 6 in safety than it is to RAID 10. But anything that gets really large, say over 20 disks, you probably want a hot spare. Not always, but almost always. So, hot spares, they're anything but a given, but they are awfully useful. They tend to only be useful in big arrays, and they lean towards more useful in parity than they are in mirrored. And remember, there are several times where it makes no sense to use them ever, and there are many cases where you need to consider alternatives and think of your desire for a hot spare as a trigger, whether that's adding additional levels of mirroring, whether it's moving to a different parity level, or whether it's moving from parity to mirroring. All of those things should be considered any time that you're considering that a hot spare may work for your environment. And remember that feeling you need a hot spare means you have a concern about the reliability of your array choice. Hot spare may be the answer to that, but there's an actual concern you need to back up and look at your goal level and say, hot spare isn't the goal, it's a solution. What is my goal? And the goal is increasing that reliability. Why do I feel I have that need for an increase? What are my different ways of tackling it? Thanks for joining me. I hope that this one is very useful. I know it's a complex one. It has a lot of factors. And it's one that people tend to think is very knee-jerk and just hot spares are good, not hot spares are bad, and it's not like that at all. So there's a lot of consideration that has to go into that and a lot of factors that people either are not aware of or don't often consider, and certainly people don't talk about very often. Remember to like and subscribe, put your comments below, and if you want to sponsor Sam IT, you can do so on Patreon.